Hey guys, welcome back. Today we need to talk about something that has been completely misunderstood in the ongoing drama surrounding It Ends With Us, Blake Lively, and Justin Baldoni. Because at the heart of this entire dispute isn't just a personality clash or creative tension. It's something much more technical, and honestly, something anyone who has worked in film long enough should absolutely understand: what nudity actually means on a professional set. Back in early April 2023, Justin Baldoni sent Blake Lively a message letting her know he had hired an intimacy coordinator for the film. That's standard practice now for projects involving intimate scenes. Blake responded positively, but said she would meet the coordinator when production officially began. At that point, everything looked cooperative and professional. There was no sign of conflict, no indication that boundaries weren't being respected. Fast forward about a month, and the intimacy coordinator followed up directly with Blake. The email laid out detailed language describing the intimate scenes in the script: what was envisioned, what would be simulated, what camera angles would capture, and most importantly, what level of nudity was being proposed. The purpose of this kind of communication is simple: clarity and consent. Nothing is left vague, nothing is assumed. Everything is spelled out in advance so the performer can approve, reject, or modify anything before stepping on set. The scenes were broken down with technical precision: simulated sex in various positions, side breast exposure without nipple exposure, camera framing from collarbone up, implied oral sex that would not be shown on camera, only suggested through editing. And the key word here is simulated and implied. That distinction matters more than people realize. Because in Hollywood, nudity isn't defined by what the audience assumes is happening. It's defined by what the camera actually captures. There's a formal industry standard, aligned with SAG guidelines, that typically defines nudity as exposure of body parts that would be covered by a bikini or Speedo. That means if those areas aren't visible on camera, it generally does not qualify as nudity in contractual terms. There's also something called implied nudity. That's when a scene is framed to make viewers think a character is naked, even though the actor is fully covered off camera. For example, a shot from the collarbone up while someone is supposedly standing in front of a mirror. The audience believes they're nude, but in reality, the actor might be wearing a tube top and sweatpants. The camera simply doesn't show anything that would meet the contractual definition of nudity. That distinction became central to everything that followed. During discussions, Blake was asked about her comfort levels and boundaries. The coordinator's job was to take Justin's creative vision and adjust it based on what Blake consented to. Anything she wasn't comfortable with would be removed. Anything agreed to would be documented in what's known as a nudity rider, essentially a ceiling of what can be filmed. The production cannot exceed what's written. If side breast is agreed to, nipple exposure cannot suddenly be requested on the day of shooting. If missionary position is approved, switching to something entirely different would require new consent. That's how the system is designed to protect actors. What's interesting here is that this was reportedly Blake's first time working with an intimacy coordinator. That may surprise people, considering her long career and previous films that included intimate scenes. But earlier in her career, intimacy coordinators were not as standard as they are today. The industry has evolved. Productions are more structured now when it comes to boundaries and consent. The tension seems to arise from how certain scenes were later characterized, particularly a birth scene in the film. According to accounts, that scene did not involve nudity as defined under SAG standards. There may have been a high hip line visible in profile, something some actors might request a writer for, but it did not involve exposure of areas typically defined as nude under industry guidelines. And notably, no additional writer was requested for that scene at the time. This is where the disconnect starts to show. Because if everything was outlined in writing beforehand, if boundaries were discussed, if scenes were clarified in advance, then the question becomes, where did the understanding break down? Was it a matter of terminology, a misunderstanding of what implied versus actual nudity means, a failure to fully review the agreed language, or something else entirely? What makes this situation so complex is that Hollywood language can sound more provocative than the reality of what is filmed. Simulated sex does not mean actual sexual contact. Implied oral does not mean anything graphic is shown. Side breast without nipple exposure is still within very specific framing rules. These are technical filmmaking terms, not tabloid headlines. And yet, once the narrative shifts publicly, those nuances disappear. What's contractual becomes emotional. What's technical becomes personal. The larger issue here isn't about whether intimate scenes existed. They clearly did. The issue is about what was agreed to, how it was defined, and whether those definitions were later reframed in a way that didn't match the documented boundaries. This case is still unfolding, and both sides will present their arguments in court. But one thing is undeniable. Understanding the difference between actual nudity and implied nudity is not optional in modern filmmaking. It's foundational. And that's exactly where this story begins.
As the production moved forward, what makes this situation even more layered is how formal and structured the process actually was behind the scenes. This wasn't a casual, last-minute decision about what would or wouldn't be shown. The intimacy coordinator's role was to sit down, define boundaries clearly, and translate creative ideas into contractual language that protected the actor. That's the entire point of having one on set. During the early May discussions, the coordinator reportedly walked through each intimate scene in detail, clarifying exactly what the camera would capture and what it would not. Scenes described as passionate or power dynamic driven were still subject to strict technical framing. Close-ups instead of wide shots, camera angles that avoided restricted areas, simulated contact instead of actual exposure, and, importantly, the understanding that anything agreed to could not be exceeded later without new consent. One concept that kept coming up in discussions was the idea that a nudity rider functions as a ceiling, not a floor. In other words, if an actor agrees to a specific level of exposure, that becomes the maximum allowed. Production cannot push beyond it on the day of filming. There's no improvisation when it comes to consent. There's no, let's just try this. Everything is documented beforehand. That structure is designed specifically to prevent the kind of on-set discomfort that has historically led to controversy in the industry. It exists so that when filming begins, there are no surprises. Now, here's where things start to feel complicated. Later statements suggested that certain scenes, particularly the birth scene, were characterized as involving nudity in a way that raised concerns. But when broken down technically, the definition becomes critical. If a high hip line is visible in profile, but no body parts defined under SAG standards are exposed, that may not legally qualify as nudity. Some performers choose to include additional protections for scenes like that. Others do not. But if no rider was requested at the time, that becomes part of the documented record. And this is where industry terminology can create confusion for the public, because viewers at home don't analyze camera framing in terms of bikini line parameters. They see a dramatic moment and assume vulnerability equals nudity. But vulnerability and contractual nudity are not the same thing. Another factor in all of this is timing. Production schedules are intense. Actors balance multiple commitments. In Blake Lively's case, she was also navigating postpartum life during this period. That adds a human layer to the story that can't be ignored. Fatigue, shifting comfort levels, emotional stress, all of that can impact how someone feels about a scene once they're physically present on set, even if they previously agreed to it in writing. But here's the legal tension. Film contracts operate on documentation, not evolving emotions. If boundaries were defined, approved, and not formally revised, the production relies on that paperwork. There's also the question of experience. Blake has been in the industry for years. She has filmed intimate scenes before, long before intimacy coordinators became standard practice. Back then, the process was often less formal, fewer safeguards, more reliance on trust and improvisation. Today, it's more structured and procedural. So when this situation escalated into a broader legal dispute, it wasn't just about one scene. It became about whether there was a misunderstanding of definitions, whether expectations shifted, or whether public narratives later reframed technical agreements into something more dramatic. Because once accusations enter the public sphere, nuance disappears fast. Words like nude carry emotional weight. They suggest exposure, vulnerability, even exploitation. But in filmmaking terms, that word has a precise contractual meaning, and if that meaning was never technically crossed, that becomes a central point of defense. At the same time, perception matters. If an actor feels uncomfortable, that experience is real to them, regardless of what a contract says. The question then becomes whether that discomfort stemmed from a breach of agreement or from a gap in understanding about what had already been approved. What makes this story compelling isn't just the legal battle, it's the collision between technical filmmaking language and personal interpretation, between documentation and memory, between what the camera actually captured and what someone later believed it represented. And as both sides prepare their cases, that distinction may ultimately determine how this unfolds in court.
As this situation moves closer to trial, the real battleground isn't just emotion or public opinion. It's paperwork, it's timestamps, it's emails. It's what was written, agreed to, and never amended. Because in a production of this scale, nothing intimate happens casually. Every scene is mapped, choreographed, documented, and approved before cameras roll. If the nudity writer outlined specific boundaries and those boundaries were not exceeded, that becomes a powerful point in court. The defense would likely argue that consent was clearly defined and respected, that the intimacy coordinator followed protocol, that the language used in the documentation matches exactly what appeared on screen. In that framework, the case becomes less about surprise and more about interpretation. But from Blake Lively's perspective, the argument may center on lived experience. Contracts can define exposure technically, but they cannot fully account for how someone feels in the moment. If she believed certain scenes crossed a line, even if they did not meet the strict legal definition of nudity, that belief becomes part of her narrative. The courtroom will ultimately decide whether that belief reflects a contractual violation or a misunderstanding of terms that were already clearly outlined. There's also the broader industry shift to consider. Intimacy coordinators are still a relatively recent addition to mainstream productions. The system is designed to create transparency, but transparency only works if everyone fully understands the terminology being used. Implied nudity, inferred nudity, simulated acts, these are clinical terms inside a legal document. Outside of that context, they can sound far more graphic than what is actually filmed, and that gap between technical language and emotional reaction is where this entire controversy seems to live. Publicly, narratives tend to simplify. Headlines reduce everything to a single charged word, nude. But filmmaking is more mechanical than that. It's camera angles, wardrobe barriers, modesty garments, lighting tricks, choreography. What the audience believes they see is often carefully constructed illusion. So the question that lingers is not just whether boundaries existed, it's whether everyone shared the same understanding of those boundaries when production began. Because once filming wraps and a project enters the public eye, perceptions harden, statements are made, legal teams get involved, and what might have once been resolved through conversation becomes part of a formal dispute. As of now, both Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni remain firm in their positions. The court process will examine communications, timelines, and definitions in detail. And whatever the outcome, this case is likely to influence how future productions document and clarify intimate scenes even more meticulously. At its core, this isn't just a celebrity dispute, it's a case study in how modern filmmaking navigates consent, documentation, and interpretation. It highlights how critical language becomes when careers, reputations, and major studio investments are involved.
We'll continue watching how this develops as more information becomes public. Let me know your thoughts below. If you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to like, subscribe, and share. I'll see you in the next one.